Round one, Sam Mitchell's had his first win as the Hawks coach. Heath Chapman saved the Dockers. Lots to discuss this morning, including the latest on Jeremy Cameron. I've been down to the Cattery this morning. The Jordan to Goey dilemma. Want to discuss that from a contract point of view. What we learnt from round one, and has the AFL backflipped on gut punches. But I will get to an important issue off the top, a very important one according to social media. On Friday, I did conclude inaccurately that 4 times 50, that's the 50-metre penalties, or in this case 8 times 50, was not 400 metres but 4 kilometres. Now, that's clearly inaccurate. It didn't reflect my fine training at Melbourne University, completing a commerce and law degree. But look, that's on me, and I apologise for those mathematicians that aptly spotted that mistake out there. Some discussion this morning regarding whether the AFL's backflipped on gut punches. It comes in response, obviously, to the Sam Draper, the Bombers' decision yesterday at the MRO in regards to his jumper punch. He did get off. He didn't get a suspension, got a $2,000 fine. The critical issue here was that the MRO, Michael Christian, mates at the AFL, described that as careless rather than intentional, and it was deemed medium impact. The critical issue, according to the MRO here, was that he was entitled to apply some pressure. It wasn't a marking contest. So it wasn't one of those traditional ones where you see the round arm in a marking contest into the guts. It was a bit different in that Draper was allowed to apply some pressure. So going forward, that I guess is the precedent for the season. There'll be some criticism on that, given I think the AFL did say they'd crack down on gut punches. But that's the distinction that the MRO made. And I guess as long as they're consistent, it's okay. But it's good from an Essendon point of view, because I want Draper this weekend. He was fined $2,000 rather than suspended. But that's the critical issue, careless rather than intentional, given the fact that he was entitled to apply some pressure in that instance. So I think that sort of just explains and perhaps calms down some of that discussion today, whether there's been some big backflip on gut punches. There hasn't. That was just deemed to be a different situation concerning Sam Draper yesterday. The latest on Jeremy Cameron. Geez, the Cats look good with Cameron. He's such a good player, but unfortunately on Saturday he had to be carted off to the Epworth Hospital. He was short of breath just to get scanned following a heavy collision. The good news this morning, I've seen him. He does look sore, but he was cleared, obviously, of any damage on Saturday night when he saw the specialists in the emergency at the Epworth. No kidney, rib or back damage. Now, I did ask him this morning whether he'll be able to play this weekend, and he didn't know. Just from an injury point of view, we'll have to go and speak to the Cats doctors about what's essentially probably now a hip pointer. They can be 2 or 3 weeks, but he's got to work through that today. He jumped into the pond or into his dam at his farm yesterday, he told me this morning, just to try and sort of relieve some of the pain and get rid of some of the symptoms and sort of shake it out. And I think it worked to an extent, but he did look pretty sore and sorry when he did arrive at the club today. We'll have those pictures on 7 News tonight. But Jeremy Cameron cleared of any damage, and hopefully he'll be free to play for the Cats as soon as this week, but they'll have to determine that based on training this week. And agenda one, want to discuss Jordan to Goey in his game for the Pies on Friday night. I understand that he'll feature heavily when the coaches' votes come out. In fact, I think he got best on ground in at least one of the group of coaches' votes that will come out from that game. It raises an interesting discussion regarding his contract status. His manager, Ryan Vague, spoke to the Herald Sun on Friday and said that De Goey's camp seemed determined to stay at Collingwood, and they're happy to negotiate or start negotiating the next 4, 6 or 8 weeks. Obviously, that's sort of in Collingwood's court. It raises a couple of interesting questions. What do the Pies do now? Do they move sooner? De Goey's clearly on his last chance currently at Collingwood, and they know, I guess, instinctively they get the best out of him when he's sort of in this situation, and he played magnificently on Friday night. A recruiter I spoke to at a rival club over the weekend said he's an absolute star. So from Collingwood's perspective, they need now to ask, A, how much they'll pay him, and B, when do they initiate contract discussions, and C, how do they protect themselves going forward from any indiscretions or embarrassment, having regard to all the fact that he's an absolute jet and clearly in form. Craig McRae was asked about the Collingwood coach post-match on Friday night in a general sense and said, look, he'll just judge De Goey on his time at the club. That's McRae's time at the club going forward. Part of the issue, of course, is how you structure up a deal, as I mentioned, how you protect against any downside and what he's worth. I'll sort of get to that in a moment, but I think the other interesting question surrounding De Goey is whether other clubs now jump in the next few weeks and try and, well, sort of get in first and start to express some interest. I think at the moment, a lot of clubs are exercising caution, particularly given the fact that he's on his last chance. Clearly, I think the AFL's been frustrated with him because they also fined him $10,000 a donation to the Salvation Army following the New York incident, if you like. But it's an interesting question now for other clubs and recruiters whether they get in there and have a bit of a crack, perhaps before they would have liked to. But I think you're going to find that he's going to be in magnificent form. Well, he certainly is already, albeit after round one this season. And it's an interesting question now for Collingwood and an interesting question for other clubs. What he's worth, well, I guess it depends on his behaviour. I don't think he's worth as much as, say, for example, Isaac Heaney, who's hitting the scoreboard and racking up huge possessions in the middle. So you'd have to say it's somewhere between, say, 700 and 850, plus some incentives. Having said that, there's a whole behavioural piece there as well. But an interesting one for Collingwood and an interesting one for other clubs, certainly in the next 4 to 6 weeks. What did we learn from round one? Well, we learned a lot. I was happy to see Sam Mitchell win yesterday, and I was happy to see the Dockers obviously very competitive. I loved watching the Giants and Swans games. They're just full of so much talent, those two sides. But the big disappointment, obviously, after their 66-point drubbing at the hands of Geelong over the weekend, was the Bombers. And this is what Matthew Lloyd had to say yesterday on the Sunday Footy Show.
Geelong were absolutely outstanding, but the Bombers were really, really poor. I thought it was a bruise-free game of football. And you don't like saying that about any side, but that's what the Bombers have to cop after yesterday. 51
clearances to 27. I know some of these guys amassed reasonable numbers of possessions, but Rutten post-match, that's Ben Rutten, the coach, clearly put the heat on the likes of Heppel, Smith, McGrath, Parrish, Merritt and Shield, basically saying, well, what do we represent? That's not our brand of football. And I think he was also of the opinion he said they didn't get their hands dirty. In terms of what the response will be this week, it'll be interesting. I think it'll be pretty tough out there at the Bombers training. I did report a couple of weeks ago that Dylan Shield did a leadership course 2 weeks before the season. He continued his training by himself during that leadership course, but I thought it was a little bit strange that he'd be doing that 2 weeks out from the season. He did that up in Sydney, and that was with the absolute cooperation of the club, but it seems a bit of an odd sort of move in my view, 2 weeks before the season. It's not the reason for their 66-point drubbing, but I think the broad question for the Bombers midfield is what they represent and what they want to do going forward. I'm sure they'll start to play some good football, or at least I hope they do, but it was an embarrassing performance for the Bombers on Saturday, and it certainly put them in the microscope this week at a time of the season when clubs want to do things like sell memberships and need the support from all their supporters. It was an untimely performance. So I think the Bombers will be clearly the big discussion point on all the shows tonight. St Kilda, they're missing a couple of midfielders, in particular Zach Jones. He's on indefinite leave for well-documented reasons with his health. There's no pressure on Jones as to when to return, but they're certainly missing him from a footy perspective. Paddy Ryder, there's no guarantee he'll play this week, particularly given the fact he's got an Achilles injury and they're flying to Perth. Dan Hannery will play in the VFL. Carlton told me yesterday there's no more, thankfully, COVID cases at the minute. Obviously, Voss will miss Thursday night, as will Jack Martin. They're quite bullish about Ash Hansen coaching. They think that they definitely think he's senior coaching material. From my experiences with him, he's a top person, and I don't think that obviously they'll miss Voss. Don't get me wrong, but I'm sure Ash Hansen, just for Carlton fans, a bit potentially worried about that out there. I think he'll do a brilliant job this weekend. Some discussion in the lead up to round one concerning crowds. The AFL had targeted a record crowd, discussing 410 to 420,000 as the total figure for round one, excluding the Adelaide game yesterday, which is TBC according to the AFL's website. The crowd is about 352,000 for the round. So let's add, say, another 25 on top of that. It's a pretty phenomenal effort, up around 380, given the new strain of COVID and obviously the fact that we're at 50% capacity in the West. But the AFL didn't quite get to that level in terms of the crowd. I did speak to the AFL yesterday, and I was just pleased with the fact that finally crowds and fans can be back at the footy, which is the main story there, and it was obviously strongly supported round one. I noticed over the course of the weekend, there's a lot of teams already not playing games, but obviously using some tactics around the stand rule. I noticed Collingwood, Melbourne and the Bulldogs used that to effect. I showed some good pictures on 7 News on that last night. I expect there could be a bit of discussion around that this week. Just what coaches are doing. We'll hear from them throughout the course of the week on various trends at the start of the season. But it's been a magnificent first round of football. Make sure you join us again on Thursday. It's going to be a big news week again, and thanks for joining us on Triple M's Tom Browne podcast today.
That was Tom Browne's news. Come back every Monday, Thursday and Friday for more, and subscribe to Triple M Footy on Listener or wherever you listen to get all our podcasts throughout the season. For Ream Hot Water and McDonald's, Triple M rocks footy.